Okay, let's start. Right, so class, if you have not already have your materials, right, please go and take out your stationery as well as the League of Nations worksheet. Okay, as I go through this set of slides, you should be able to fill in the blanks for pages 4 to 6 of the League of Nations, right, about their weaknesses. Okay, so let me just start by recapping. Okay, the aim of the League of Nations, which was to achieve world peace. Okay, achieve world peace not through resorting to violence, not through resorting to war with other countries, but by by calm discussion, sorting out international disputes where and when, as and when they. Okay, so just a very quick recap. How would this world peace be achieved? Mainly through two objectives: collective security as well as disarmament. Okay, so if you want, you can pause this video or the slideshow recording at this point in time in order to revise by yourself if you need to. Okay, so peacekeeping measures of the League of Nations. I believe we've gone through all of these, right, including including how they are intended to work and how in the different ways in which they became quite ineffective. All right, so okay, so now let's look at the weaknesses of League of Nations, beginning with the structural weaknesses, right? Structural weaknesses, talking about the structure, how League of Nations was even set up to begin with, how it was meant to work, right? In the first place, was not very effective, and we'll look at how. Okay, why, in what ways they are weak in terms of their inherent setup. Okay, so the structural weaknesses. Before we move on to talking about the weaknesses in depth, right? This is just an overview of how the League of Nations is set up to begin with. Okay, so firstly, the General Assembly, right? Let me just point out first the two main ones, which would be the General Assembly as well as the Council. Okay, so the General Assembly made up of all of the nations involved in the League, as well as the Council, right? You have four permanent members, including Britain and France. Okay, and yeah. Okay, so now let's look at organizational weaknesses, right? So firstly, the Secretariat, which was the one that was in charge of organizing all of these meetings, right, keeping records, was very understaffed and disorganized. Okay, and the next thing is that the roles of the Assembly and the Council were not clear. Not clear in the sense that both the Assembly and the Council seem to make very overlapping, sometimes contradictory decisions. Okay, and next, it was also very hard to make any decisions, and I believe this is where we stopped the last lesson, because any action required a unanimous vote by the council. Okay, so unanimous meaning not the majority, but you want a total, right? You want everyone to agree or disagree. Okay, so and the next thing was that any decision required a 2/3 majority vote in the assembly, which was so difficult to achieve since there were so many nations. If I remember correctly, I believe it was about 40 nations, right? And each of these nations have their own self-interest in mind. So it's going to be very hard for them to agree on the same decision. Okay, now we'll look at lack of authority. Okay, and I believe we've talked about this before. The fact that some of their peacekeeping measures seem quite ineffective. The first thing is that the League of Nations had no army of its own to stop aggressive countries, right? And the next thing is that it was very, very unpopular, and it suffered from a lack of respect. Okay, because out of the 40 nations that joined the League, 31 had taken part in the war on the side of the Allies, right? The Allies being the ones that actually won the World War I. So immediately, right, what kind of image would the League of Nations actually have? Okay, and the League of Nations was seen as a league for the countries that won World War I, right? It was not seen as a league that was neutral and fair. Okay, it was seen as some kind of a club for these winners of the war. Okay, so now let's look at the lack of authority in terms of the peacekeeping measures of the trade bans, right? The fact that the League of Nations had no real economic power to enforce economic sanctions, right? How the economic sanctions were meant to work to begin with is that they are supposed to enforce these trade bans on the offending nation, right? But the problem with this is that there's no way to ensure that all of the League of Nations will actually keep to this agreement, right? Because for many of these nations, right, the trade ban would actually work both ways, in the sense that not only does the offending nation suffer, but the nation that decides to impose this trade ban would also suffer economically. Okay, and the thing is, the aggressor nation could also trade with non-league members. Okay, and now we'll look at membership issues. Okay, starting with the USA and their refusal to join, right? Because of their non-interventionist policy. Okay, we will look at this in more detail. Okay, and some countries were not allowed to join. Okay, namely Germany, because it was being blamed, it had to accept total blame for World War One. They were seen as a threat, and therefore not allowed to join the League of Nations, which also seems quite contradictory if you think about it. If right, the country that is seen as such a threat is not allowed to join a country, not allowed to join the organization which is meant to keep world peace in mind, right? How then is the League of Nations meant to work then? Okay, and the Soviet Union, Russia was only allowed to join in 1934 because of their communist ideology. Okay, so this means that many powerful countries which were not part of the League of Nations, okay, and it also means that League of Nations, right, their decisions may not necessarily apply, right, to these countries which are not part of the League. Okay, so it leaves them very weak, very ineffective. Okay, now let's move on to self-interest of the major powers, beginning with the US. Alright, so firstly, even though all of these nations are being part of the League of Nations, right, if they view their own interests as being more important than the main goal of achieving world peace and security, this makes the League very difficult to succeed. And we see this already through, the unsuccessful aim of trying to achieve disarmament, right? Disarmament meaning the reduction of military forces, reduction of the number of military weapons as well. Right, so member countries, they're supposed to disarm, they're supposed to reduce their military forces, military weapons, but because they distrusted each other, and they wanted the ability to protect their own country, right, so many of them decided not to disarm. Okay, so now let's look at the USA, right? So can I get you guys to take some time, just pause the video for a bit and look at this source here, right? Who are the figures you can identify, right? And what is this source trying to say about the USA? Okay, I hope you guys have actually taken some time to look at this source for yourself, right? So let's break this down together. Right, so the very first figure that you see here, right, is Uncle Sam, right, otherwise known as the representative, right? This figure here represents the USA. Okay, right, and if you look at his face, he seems a bit upset, right? And why is he upset? He's looking over at this boat here, right? It's a bit small, but you should be able to see, right, the League of Nations. Okay, and we can assume that the other figures on the boat would actually refer to the other member nations who are already part of the League of Nations, who have joined the League of Nations. Okay, and then the next thing we also see is all of these children, these kids, right? And we wonder, right, who are these children, right? And we get a clue here, the US, right, Senate. Okay, which we know, okay, is probably referring to the government. Okay, so if we put all of these together, right, we look at these children pulling on the coattails of the USA, the boat, the LN boat carrying all of the other nations, right, leaving. What we can say about this source is that the USA seems unwilling to join the rest of the member nations in the League of Nations. Okay, and the reason being that they were being hindered by their own government, by their own people as well, who did not really want, who were more interested in their own affairs, right? Look at them, they are not even looking at the League of Nations, they're not looking outside the door, right? They're just looking at their own playing blocks, they're looking at each other, right? They're more concerned with the affairs of the USA itself, within the USA. Okay, Alright, so let's go on, right? So the USA did not want to be pulled into the problems of other countries after World War One, right? So that's what it means to be non-interventionist, right? That's what it means to be isolationist, right? They wanted to be isolated. They did not want to meddle in the affairs of the other countries. So that means that they refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and they did not want to commit their resources and people to the League of Nations. Okay, and why is this a problem, right? If you remember the source with Woodrow Wilson, right, the US president, right, he was blowing bubbles, right, and the biggest bubble of them all was the League of Nations, right? It was his dream. It was his 14 points, right, the principles of the 14 points that inspired the creation of the League of Nations. But if you don't even have, right, the USA as part of your League of Nations, right, even though the USA was the one that inspired this creation, right, what does this actually say about the League of Nations then? Okay, the next thing is that the USA was the strongest country economically and militarily, which means that they actually had the power, okay, to enforce their will, right? But if, right, this power is absent, right, since the US did not join, okay, then what does this actually mean for the League of Nations? Were they able to enforce their own decisions? Were they able to achieve their aim of world peace? Okay, so other countries saw USA as a flaw and weakness and did not see much point in joining or being a part of it. Okay, so now let's move to Britain and France's attitude of pacifism, right? Pacifism referring to, right, the desire for peace, okay, and as well as war weariness, okay. So war weariness meaning that they were very tired of war, okay, because if you look at this graph here, World War One casualties, right, after Germany, after Russia, France suffered the most number of casualties, right, the most number of people dead, right, followed by Austria-Hungary as well as Britain and their empire. Okay, so they were very focused on rebuilding their own economy, on recovering after the war. They were very tired of wars, very reluctant to be involved in international matters, and more concerned about protecting their own country. So when we look at the case studies of the League of Nations, right, whether the League of Nations was ultimately successful or unsuccessful, okay, these two, right, Germany's remilitarization as well as Italy's invasion of Abyssinia as well as Japan, right, we'll look at Japan in the upcoming lesson, right. Britain and France, right, they were unable to really lead the League of Nations, right, to stop these three countries from doing what they wanted. Okay, and why they did not want to anger or start another war which they were not prepared for. Okay, and also let's look at Italy and Japan's dissatisfaction, right? Both these countries actually got rewards received after World War One, right? They were on the side of the Allies, so they had actually won the war on the side of the Allies, right? So these rewards would refer to the land, right, the territories that were taken away from Germany, for example, right? And Japan in particular felt that they were being discriminated against at the assembly, right? They felt that their voice was not actually being heard despite joining the League of Nations. Okay, and Japan felt that it deserved a larger share of the far eastern pie, right? So it wanted more land, right? It wanted more land. It was increasingly aware of its lack of resources. Okay, so spoiler alert, this is how World War II happens. Okay, so this means that they will actually view the League with suspicion and distrust, since they were offended by how insignificantly they were treated. Okay. So very last weakness that we'll talk about, the impact of the Great Depression. Alright, so what was this Great Depression to begin with, right? It was this severe economic depression in the United States. So it started in the United States and then it reverberated around the world. Okay, so for the USA in particular, they did not have enough money to lend to other countries, right? And already as not being absent from the League of Nations meant that they could not also help the other European countries to maintain peace. Okay, so it also led to decreased trade among other countries, right, and lower employment. Okay, since the USA was the biggest economy at that time, right? So the Great Depression, right, what I want you guys to take away from it is the fact that USA was suffering, but because it was the largest economy at the time, right, its suffering meant that a lot of the other countries suffered as well. Okay, so let's look at Britain and France first, right? So because they were affected by the economic problems, right, League of Nations was considered less important, was given less attention, right? They wanted to focus more on recovering economically by themselves. Okay, and for Japan, right, already they found that they were suffering from a lack of resources, right? The Great Depression made it worse. Okay, so Japan saw the invasion of other countries as a solution to her economic problems. Okay, so link that to the start of World War II as well. Okay, for Italy, right, the economy was badly affected, and for them, their leader saw it as an opportunity to use overseas invasions, right, as a way to distract his people from the economy problems. And lastly, with Germany, right, with mass unemployment and poverty on the rise, right, many people turn to more radical ideas, right, such as this man here, Adolf Hitler, right. We will study about Germany, the rise of Hitler, probably in the next semester or the next term or so. Okay, so this I have come to the end of this set of slides. All right, so do make sure that you have all the answers to pages 4 to 6 filled up. I think you can also look back at your the structured question that was given to you, the structured essay question that was given to you about the League of Nations. That was your Chinese New Year homework. See if you can add on, right, to the essay that you've written. Okay, so see you guys on Monday. Alright, and that's all.